Good evening. Hello, everybody. My name is Deborah Panetta. I am the chairman of the Saugus Board of Selectmen and the president of the Saugus River Watershed Council. I want to first thank each and every one of you for coming out this evening to hear about this very important topic. I'd like to thank our sponsor, the Alliance for Health and the Environment, for being the watchdogs for not just Precinct 3 and Precinct 10 in Saugus and Point of Pines and Revere and parts of Lynn, but for all of our communities, because they're looking out for the quality of life for you and for me and for our families. I'd like to introduce a few folks that are here this evening. We have our town manager, Scott Crabtree from Saugus. Thank you, Scott, for coming. We have some Saugus Town meeting members that are in the audience. We have Martin Costello, Steve DeViglio, Pam Goodwin, Ann Devlin, Joyce Rodenheiser, and from the Revere City Council, we have Mr. John Powers. I'd also like to thank Saugus Cable and Revere Cable for coming out this evening, because we were able to show this presentation so that many more folks are able to watch it and be educated. And that's really why we're here tonight, to have our questions asked and answered. It is my privilege and honor now to introduce Rosalie Vincent. Representative Rosalie Vincent was just re-elected for another 2 years, and we're thrilled because she looks out for the health and well-being of not just her constituents, but everyone that she comes in contact with. She has been the advocate for our environment. She's been a very good friend to many, many of us. And I look forward to working with Rosalie, not just for the next 2 years, but for many, many years to come. So with that said, Rosalie.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Deb, for those kind words and for your work on this issue. Deb truly is a champion of the environment, and I am so blessed that I get to work with her and the other members of the Alliance for a cleaner environment. I want to also thank our keynote speaker, Mike Ewald from the Energy Justice Network, and Kirsty Pesci from Conservation Law, and Mary Lester from Saugus River Watershed Council. And I am so proud to be part of this Alliance for Health and Environment. We have been an amazing advocate for the closure of the unlined ash landfill in Saugus and educating the public about the dangers of landfills and incineration. And none of our work could be possible without the efforts of the Alliance. So in no particular order, I just want to introduce the members of the Alliance. Conservation Law Foundation, Toxics Action Center, Clean Water Action, SAVE, the Saugus River Watershed Council, the Point of Pines Beach Association, the Friends of Belle Isle Marsh, the Revere City Council President Jessica Giannino, our Revere City Councilor John Powers, who's here tonight. Thank you, John, for always being here for us. And Revere City Councilor Joanne McKenna, as well as dedicated Revere residents like Elle Baker and Loretta Lacetra, and obviously our Saugus resident Jackie Mercurio. And to my constituents and the residents of East Saugus, Riverside, and the Point of Pines, please know that fighting for you and for the expansion of the unlined ash landfill is something I plan on doing, and I will continue to do this for my term in office. You are a priority for me as a state representative. And in January, I plan on refiling legislation that would codify the concept of environmental justice And I will also be working hard to put legislation to give surrounding communities a voice when it comes to placement of incineration and ash landfills. Working with the Alliance and the Conservation Law Foundation in particular, we are continuing to push forward with an appeal of the DEP's decision to grant Wheeler-Brader its permit to expand, and we are committed to continue to work on this issue. With that, I would like to welcome the Saugus River Watershed Council's new Executive Director, Mary Lester, to offer remarks. Thank you all for coming.
Good evening. My name is Mary Lester. I recently took over for Joan LeBlanc as the director of the Saugus River Watershed Council. I spent many years serving on the board as well as the current chair of the Land Conservation Commission. I truly appreciate all of the warming reception from all of you in this new position. As most of you are aware, filling Joan's shoes is anything but uncomplicated. The Saugus River Watershed Council is a nonprofit organization founded in 1991. They were founded to protect, restore natural resources on the Saugus River watershed. Our area of focus encompasses all of Saugus and significant portions of Lynn, Revere, and 8 other surrounding communities. The Wheeler-Brader Saugus Waste Incinerator and Ash Landfill are located within the most ecological valuable area of our watershed, the Rumney Marshes area of critical environmental concern. The Council has been actively working to protect and restore the natural resources of the region by working with federal, state, and local environmental agencies. Residents of public officials on the watershed efforts, such as protecting and restoring wetlands, monitoring and promoting restoration of historic fisheries, monitoring and improving water quality, removing illegally dumped debris, and educating the public about natural resources of Rumney Marsh. Also, the Saugus River Watershed Council regularly reviews projects during local and state environmental permitting processes and provides written and oral comments to promote environmental protection and restoration. There we go. The Saugus River Watershed Council is also a founding member of the Alliance for the Health and Environment, a collaboration of public officials, who are all here, environmental organizations, and concerned citizens that work together to promote understanding and address environmental and public health concerns associated with the waste incineration and the ash disposal. I wanted to discuss a little bit about the purpose of the area of critical environmental concern and where the ACEC boundaries lie. Like, this is something that we hear every day but might not actually realize where the boundaries are. The east boundary runs along 1A on the bottom here. The west boundary runs right on the other side of Cap's Auto on the river. The blue arrow shows us right in the middle of the Wheeler-Brader site, as well within the ACEC. The effects of the designation were spelled out in section 1212 of the ACEC regulations and are as follows. I should put those on the slide. Okay, so the designation of an ACEC. All environmental agencies that take action, administer programs, and revise regulations in order to acquire useful scientific data on the ACEC, preserve, restore, or enhance the resources of the ACEC, and ensure activities in or impacting the area are carried out so as to minimize adverse effects on marine and aquatic productivity, surface and groundwater quality, habitat values, storm damage prevention or flooding control, scenic and recreational resources, and other natural resource values of the area. So the purpose of the ACEC designation, the long-term preservation, management, and stewardship of critical resources and ecosystems cannot be accomplished through state regulations or programs alone. The stewardship of these resources is a responsibility shared by all citizens. From a practical perspective, the goals of the ACEC designation can only be achieved through cooperation and collaborative efforts involving all of us. Private and public organizations, governmental agencies, local officials, civic and environmental organizations, and residents of the ACEC communities, people just like all of you. As I was doing a little background research, I found this stated by DCR. The Rumney Marshes ACEC has been characterized by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as one of the most biological significant estuaries in Massachusetts north of Boston. The area includes approximately 1,000 acres of highly productive salt marsh, tidal flats, and shallow subtidal channels. Made me really think that there's no amount of engineering, permitting that can negate the negative impacts on this ACEC by taking it and ripping open a cap of coastal landfill and bringing over 500,000 tons of contaminated ash for disposal. I think all of us in this room can find it extremely counterintuitive that DCR claims this is an area that is so significant and DEP is absolutely willing to destroy it. According to the subsurface water quality standards, the most stringent water quality anti-degradation standards are reserved for waters designated as outstanding resource waters. According to section 4.043, these waters constitute an outstanding resource as well determined by their outstanding socio-economic, recreational, ecological, and/or aesthetic values. The quality of these waters shall be protected and maintained. And according to the Wetland Protection Act, performance standards for the coastal resource areas as well within the ACEC is raised to one, no adverse effect on the interest of the Act. So, that being said, there is no surface water quality monitoring, no groundwater monitoring, no sediment monitoring in the marshes or the rivers adjacent to the coastal landfill. Nothing is required. It seems inconceivable that there is no accountability for any sort of testing. One of Saugus River Council's, Watershed Council's top priorities is working to raise awareness about the impact of climate change. The watershed develop effective climate adaptation and mitigation strategies to protect natural resources throughout the watershed. Climate change is already having an impact on natural resources in New England, and those impacts are expected to increase in the future. Impacts to the Saugus River watershed include sea level rise, coastal storm surge, extended dry periods, more intense rainstorms and flooding, increases in temperature, changes in aquatic vegetation, tidal influence moving upstream, and shifts in fish and wildlife habitat. Climate change is showing high relativity to sea level rise and coastal storm surges. A study released during the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in February of 2016 indicates that sea level rise along the Massachusetts coastline and other New England areas are expected to continue to rise at sea level, and that the sea level rise in our region will outpace other parts of the world. In Revere, which is one of the Massachusetts tracking sites, sea level rose 9.3 inches during the past century, compared to an average global sea level rise of 5.4 inches during the same period. Scientists who predicted that sea level rise in New England will continue to rise 4.4 to 11 inches in the next 80 years. So it's not hard to figure out that its location along the Pines River in Revere, Wheeler-Bader's ash landfill will clearly be impacted by sea level rise and other impacts such as coastal storm surge. The Saugus River Watershed Council has also been working diligently on climate adaptation as well as mitigation planning in the watershed. Efforts to evaluate sea level rise and storm surge and develop strategies to protect public health, the environment, and coastal infrastructure impacts. Changes in climate are very well underway in the Saugus River Watershed. In 2015, the Saugus River Watershed published a resource document, developed strategies for promoting coastal resiliency and sustainability. This was to provide access to some of the best planning resources and tools for community leaders, property owners, developers, builders, planners, teachers, and basic guidance for adaptation. In 2016, the City of Lynn completed a coastal vulnerability and risk assessment. This was to identify the vulnerabilities and develop coastal protection and adaptation strategies to protect critical infrastructure. The Saugus River Watershed Council served as an active member. We worked with groups assisting the City of Lynn with community-based efforts to assess vulnerability associated with sea level rise, storm surge, and plan for adapting to future conditions along the Lynn shoreline and the Saugus River. As noted in the assessment, effects of climate change on the coast can be as devastating as high tide water levels becoming increasingly higher and flood coastal areas. More intense storms coupled with sea level rise result in storm damage to increasingly larger areas, and increasing storm intensities and rising sea levels change wave patterns and increase the rate of shoreline erosion and loss of coastal land. The City of Lynn's assessment also identified site-specific risk, vulnerabilities such as erosion to shoreline retreat, affecting stability of a landfill along Lynn's waterfront due to sea level rise and storm surge. Lynn's Coastal Resiliency Assessment is an important planning tool, identifying vulnerabilities and reducing future risks for public health and the environment. The plan highlighted some of the risks specific to contaminated sites, including erosion damage controls, for example, the damage of the cap, preventing contact with the contaminated soils. Remediation systems, such as groundwater treatment, may also be damaged by storms and flooding. We currently, as the Saugus River Watershed Council, are working with the City of Lynn on their MVP program for the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, and we'll continue to do that as long as they need our help. So further upstream, the Saugus River Watershed Council partnered with the National Park Service to develop a climate adaptation and mitigation strategies to prevent potential pollution to the river from historic contamination of a slag pile. This slag pile was located on the banks of the Saugus River at the Saugus Iron Works. The site is located in the upper limit of the tidal influence of the Saugus River. Climate adaptation and mitigation efforts at this site included identifying a range of strategies to protect the natural resources of the Saugus River from potential arsenic contamination that was associated with the historic slag pile. This slag pile is adjacent to the river. The National Park Service identified the need and identified and implemented proactive protections and capped the former waste site at the highest environmental priority for climate adaptation strategies. Within its location adjacent to the estuary and significant larger footprint, the Wheelabrator Saugus facility is a much higher risk than the Saugus Iron Works. They have coastal impacts such as erosion from predicted sea level rise, increasing intense coastal storms, and potentially damaged storm surges. In order to identify the climate change adaptation and mitigation, the watershed, Saugus River Watershed Council considers whether sites or regional areas are a high priority or whether they are at risk for impacts from climate change. The highest priorities for climate change and adaptation and mitigation are the sites that both considered high risk. The Wheelabrator Ash Landfill has been identified as one of the highest priorities for climate change adaptation and mitigation in the watershed because it is located in the highest priority natural resource area in the Saugus River watershed and the high risk impacts from sea level rise and coastal storm surge. Forward a little bit. Yeah, that's good. So why is the ash landfill a particular concern? Wheelabrator Saugus is located within the southern portions of the Saugus River watershed, adjacent to the Saugus River and outstanding resource water, the Rumney Marsh and the ACEC. The Rumney Marsh's ACEC is over 2,600 acre urban salt marsh extending into Lynn, Saugus, Revere, Boston, and Winthrop. The region of the ACEC was designated an ACEC in 1988 to preserve the critical environment and most biological significant salt marsh north of Boston. I think you can go forward. No, that's good. The marsh contains flounder, alewife, rainbow smelt, American eel, soft-shelled crab, razor clams, mussels, and a variety of native and migratory birds. So above all, I'm here tonight to make it clear that we, as a council, are adamantly opposed to the expansion that will allow Wheelabrator to rip open the portion of the landfill that is currently capped and continue dumping contaminated ash at a high vulnerable site. We have no faith that DEP will even stop there. Throughout New England and beyond, coastal management agencies and public officials are working diligently to identify and minimize environmental and public health risk associated with facilities like these. Wheelabrator Ash Landfill is located in the ACEC adjoining to the Pines and the Saugus River estuaries. potentially damaging storm surge associated with climate change. One of the most appalling aspects of the proposed expansion of this ash landfill is that Wheelabrator proposed to completely rip out 39 acres of grassland bird habitat in order to reopen an active cap portion of the landfill. This is completely out of compliance with the consent order, the landfill closure plan, and the requirements for the bird habitat on the site. Massachusetts has been a leader in the climate change adaptation planning, efforts in sea level rise, and taking protective steps to reduce risk to people and the environment from coastal damage. Even when capped, this landfill poses a significant risk to rivers, wetlands, neighborhoods, and nearby beaches. Because of its location within the dynamic coastal environment, the Wheelabrator Saugus ash landfill will be increasingly impacted by sea level rise and damaging storm surge. Because the fly ash with lead, mercury, cadmium, arsenic, and other pollutants has been disposed throughout the landfill, any leaching or breach could pose a significant risk to public health and contaminate critical environmental resources, including salt marshes and shellfish beds. This site could be just one major coastal storm away from creating an environmental disaster, with contaminated ash emptying our waterways, beaches, and coastal neighborhoods. I thank you for your time, and I thank everyone here for their dedication to this project. Next, we have Mike Ewell, the Director of Energy.
No, Mike is next week. Oh, you switched it. Yeah, we switched it. Yeah,
Switch it up a little bit, just to confuse me, I think. Energy Justice Network attorney, fighting dirty energy and waste facilities since he was in high school. And he works for resource communities nationwide.
Hi, everyone. So great to be here. I've actually said I've been active since I was in high school, which, dating myself, was 1990 when I first got involved and first fought this same very company, Wheelabrator, when I was in high school, because they came to my home county and built an incinerator there and tried to get trash from my hometown and from all 54 municipalities in my home county near Philadelphia. We stopped all but 4 of them from signing contracts. But Philadelphia signed a big one, so they still got to build. But we'll take them out in time. Right now, I'm working nationally. I'm running a group I founded called Energy Justice Network, which will soon be the main slide in the presentation. So I've been involved with helping communities all across the country. Currently, we're very focused in Baltimore, which is another case of a Wheelabrator trash incinerator, which is the biggest air polluter in the city of Baltimore. We are working actively to get that shut down and believe that we have the support at the city level to get the laws passed we need to make sure that we have clean air in Baltimore. So this is something that has been a passion for me, and not just because it's something that I got started with, but because after a lot of research and looking into all sorts of dirty energy and waste facilities that we help communities fight across the country, from coal to natural gas to nuclear power to the oil industry to biomass and biofuels, the whole wide range of things that can harm communities, including landfills. I've helped people fight them all. And yet trash incinerators, we've maintained a focus on because I've learned and found out and done the research to show that they're the most expensive and polluting way to manage waste or to make energy. And so I'm going to present some of that here. We're already on the second slide. So if you go here on our website, you'll find a lot of information. There's a lot more even beyond that. So I'll make sure you have my contact information. It'll be in the last slide as well. I have cards I can give out to. And if you have any questions, just get in touch, shoot me an email, text me, call me, say, Mike, what about this? They said this in a meeting. Is that true? And I will make sure you have the best answers that are available to you. Okay. All right, so one of the sites that we have a lot of web projects. We're kind of a combination of organizers, networkers, and data geeks. So this is the data geek part of what we do. So we built some maps, including this site here. And on this site, you can find all of the electric generating facilities, all the incinerators, all the landfills in the country. You can get data on them. You can look up the demographics of who's around them, put layers on there from race and class layers. So this here is a layer showing the operating trash incinerators in the country. Now, do you see a trend? Yeah, so I live in the middle of that big cluster of pins as well. And so part of this is because there's basically, if you draw concentric circles around New York City, you can see the geography of landfill disposal prices. And so only in the areas where the landfill disposal prices are higher have incinerators been able to even remotely compete. But even with that, they need to market themselves as renewable energy and get subsidized that way and get all sorts of subsidies so they can compete because they're not a competitive enterprise. But that's part of why that geography looks the way it is. So this is one of my more encouraging slides you'll see. The number of operating incinerators in the country has dropped dramatically. It used to be close to 200. We're now down to about 75 in the country. And I believe this will keep collapsing. There are a few more that are on the edge right now. One announced closure just recently, and others are on their way. And I think this is one of the ones that needs to be on their way, considering it's the oldest one in the country, and it really needs to go. But this, if not for activism of communities like yours around the country, stopping so many, like hundreds of proposals, that would have been about 3 times as high. There were several hundred proposals that were made in the country and stopped one community at a time by folks like you in this room. So this is unreadable on purpose. These are just the victories that we've had in the span of 5 years, from 2010 to 2014. Different community groups across the country that were part of Energy Justice Network that fought off trash incinerators, biomass incinerators, poultry waste, all kinds of waste that people wanted to burn. And one community after another, they were stopped. And so the fact that you can't read it is, I think, is a good thing. There's so many of them. Go ahead. And this is just another encouraging slide that to show you over the past several decades, there have been waves of development of companies trying to build 1,000 nuclear reactors and about 1,000 natural gas power plants as well. Several hundred coal power plants. And this slide shows that of all those that were proposed, most have been defeated, one community at a time. So most of them are not operating, and the ones that were, a good chunk of them were shut down. So it's encouraging to know that when people get organized, they can win, and they can not only prevent bad things from happening in their community, but they can shut down existing facilities too. There's never a done deal. There's no such thing as a done deal. It can always be undone by good organizing. Okay, so some of the names that will get used. This industry is famous for playing name games. I've actually sat in their own industry conferences and heard them complain in their meetings afterward that too many of their presenters use the I word. And the I word is incinerator. And they will fight you to the death over that word some of the time. And a lot of the time they prefer to say we're waste to energy facilities. So then they rebranded themselves. In that meeting they actually said, one of the gentlemen in the meeting said, we just went through all this effort to change the name of our division from waste to energy from waste. And that's almost laughable, but it's a subtle PR twist for them, which makes them sound more like they're about energy production instead of being primarily waste facilities, which they are. So a lot of other terms. Look out for things like sustainable materials management and integrated. These are other code words for incineration is preferred over landfilling, which is not true, but EPA perpetuates that with some of their sustainable materials management language. All right, so some basic lessons on why incinerators are a problem. First is just that it's garbage in, garbage out. And when I say that, I mean not literally what you might think of garbage bags coming out. But if you put mercury in to an incinerator, it's going to come out somewhere. If you put chlorine atoms in, like chlorinated plastics, like vinyl, like Barbie dolls and PVC vinyl siding, that's the recipe for making the most toxic chemicals known to science called dioxins. And those chlorine atoms that come in, they come out. And they come out often in a more dangerous, more toxic form. So when you put dangerous things in, like heavy metals that are toxic, or halogens like chlorine, in there, they're going to come out in some shape or form. And it's usually in some combination of air pollution and ash. Also, nothing is 100%. So when they say, oh, we have these fancy scrubbers on our stacks, so trust us, we're not going to have anything bad in your air. Well, even the fanciest pollution control systems do not take 100% of anything out. The fanciest ones get 99 point something out. Some of them get lower 90%. And the fact is that when you're talking about putting through, was it 1,500 tons per day into this facility? It doesn't take much to be that small percent, when you multiply times that many tons a day going into the air, to be significant for human health. When we're talking about things as toxic as mercury and dioxins and cadmium and arsenic and things that in very, very small doses can cause disease in people and can also climb up the food chain in several cases. So kind of covered a bit of this. You're not dealing with that company, so we'll move on. Go ahead. All right, so one of the larger problems is that incinerators, they are not resource recovery facilities. That's another word that used to be a good word. It used to mean recycling. And then about at least a third of the trash incinerators in the country name themselves resource recovery facilities. So now it's just a word for incinerators. But they're not recovering resources, they're destroying them. When you burn trash, there's a lot of material in there that's very valuable. And when you burn it, you're basically making it so that you have to recreate it from raw materials. So if you take the paper that's on your table right now and think of how that paper was made. They had to chop down trees, they had to truck them to a paper mill, they had to burn coal or sometimes now tires in a paper mill to heat it to make that paper. They had to then ship that to some kind of store that sells it to you. And when you recycle it, you avoid having to put all that energy out in tailpipes and smokestacks that created that paper. That's called embodied energy. That's energy that's not physically present in the paper, but if you recycle it, you don't have to reinvest all that energy. And that's why when they say it's a waste to energy facility, we say you're a waste of energy facilities, because when you burn that paper, all that energy it took to make it is not in there anymore. So you can't get all that energy back. You actually save 3 to 5 times more energy by recycling and composting the materials that are being fed into that incinerator right now than you can get back by burning it. So in that global view of how valuable those materials are, they're waste of energy facilities, and that's how we like to reframe some of this. Now there's also an issue with environmental racism. We'll get into that in a later slide, but in this community is not an exception to what we see in Chester and Detroit and Baltimore and Newark and so many other communities I've been working in. We'll get to global warming soon too. So, yeah, the last part here is just burning things makes the problem invisible. It makes it like it's going away. And we need to make our waste problems in our society more visible so that we're actually confronted with the need to do something about it, and we'll be talking about solutions in zero waste. All right, so in rebranding things, it's not trash to steam. You've all taken showers, right? You've seen, you know what steam is? It's water vapor. Are we throwing just water or just ice cubes in our trash cans? No. So if you think of all the things that are in trash, you can't make just steam by burning it. So all the things that are in trash are part of the exhaust that's coming out of incinerators, and it's a lot more than water vapor. That's why they need pollution control devices and have air permits from the state. So they're really trash to toxic ash and toxic air emissions facilities. When you burn 100 tons of trash, you get about 30 tons of highly toxic ash that has to go to a landfill like the one in your backyard that you just saw on the map. And the other 70 tons don't turn into energy. They don't magically disappear. They become air pollution. So you can't make those tons disappear. They just change form and location. We already talked about why they're waste of energy. Okay, so in 2013, before DC City Council, I was testifying, and the person who's the mouthpiece for this whole industry's trade association, Ted Michaels, lives not far from DC, so bump into this guy sometimes. And we were testifying at the same table, and I made the claim that trash incineration is the most expensive and polluting way to manage waste or make energy. And he admitted on camera, and it's on DC government's website now still, that I was right on half of those points. I think he needs some better public relations lessons. But one of the things, I watched the video many times to get this quote down exact, and he admitted that incineration, which of course he calls waste to energy, is more expensive than landfill. So this is how the mouthpiece of the industry itself admitting that they're more expensive. So I won on that point. Go on. This is another industry source from a different trade association for the waste industry generally, and they found the same thing when they looked at this nationwide, that incineration has always been more expensive than landfill. Now, how are they in terms of energy? They love to say they're energy producing facilities. They're very small in terms of energy production. No one in their right mind would think, how do I make energy? Let's burn trash. It doesn't happen. But part of the reason it doesn't happen is because they're the most expensive option. This is the federal government's data, the Energy Information Administration, part of the Department of Energy. And they've done 2 reports looking at this in recent years, and in both of those reports, trash incineration came out to be the most expensive to build and the most expensive to operate and maintain of any form of making electricity, except for some really rare things that don't happen because they're so expensive, like coal gasification. Actually, even that's cheaper, but there's some versions that are more expensive. But for the most part, this is definitely on the top. So what's fascinating about this is that it's more expensive to operate and maintain, even though they get paid to take their fuel. What's the difference between a fuel and a waste? Anyone hazard a guess?
Fuel can be converted into energy.
That's not where I'm going, because waste, I mean, nothing's being converted into energy, as we already discussed, right? You get energy out of it, but you're not turning matter into energy. That violates the laws of physics, and that's not, thankfully, what's happening. But the economics are what determine what the difference is between a fuel and a waste. If you're burning a fossil fuel, or if you're running a nuclear reactor, or anything, a tree burning power plant, a biomass power plant, as they like to call it, they're paying to get what they burn or use as a fuel. A trash incinerator gets paid to take it. That's the main difference between a fuel and a waste, is just who pays who. And even though they're getting paid to take their fuel, their waste, they're still the most expensive. And that's just amazing. And that's largely because the pollution control devices are about half the cost of a plant. They're very expensive, and they have to have so many. And even with all those devices, they're still dirtier than coal, which I'll show you in a second. So, some other points I'll go through quickly. They're very expensive. We can come back to that. But do they put or pay clause contracts in here? Do we know that? We don't know this yet. But a lot of communities, including Wheelbrader when they were operating an incinerator in Claremont, New Hampshire, have contracts that have these clauses that are known as put or pay clauses. You say, like say Boston has a contract to give the incinerator a certain amount of waste each year. And if they don't give them that certain amount of waste, they pay as if they did, which penalizes the city or any local town if they reduce, reuse, recycle, or compost, because they have to pay even though they're not paying or not producing that waste. And then Wheelbrader can turn around and get paid twice for that capacity because they're getting paid for not taking it from one place, and then they can get someone else's waste to fill the gap. So in Claremont, New Hampshire, we had 29 towns that actually filed for bankruptcy in the 90s because of put or pay clauses in their contracts. And the judge denied them, so they had to actually pay up anyway. So this is not unusual. A lot of incinerator contracts have that in them. So it competes also with recycling and other parts of the zero waste solutions. It also competes with clean energy. Massachusetts is one of many states where you have a renewable energy mandate in the state, and trash incineration somehow qualifies as if it's renewable, even though half of what they're burning is oil-based plastics, fossil fuel. In terms of the energy value, half comes from the fossil fuel side. But they still get considered renewable, and so they get subsidized by that. And so they're competing, sometimes even with wind power in some states. And these economic incentives basically encourage them in the wrong direction. For example, they can even get paid more to take more dangerous types of waste like industrial waste, and so there's an economic incentive for them to do that. We see that a lot of plants doing that. Go ahead. All right, so I actually need to update this slide. I meant to, I'm sorry. A lot of times we talk about how they compete with recycling. And they do compete with recycling in many cases. The industry loves to insist it's the opposite, and they're very compatible with recycling. But in fact, there are a lot of very hard examples where they're competing with recycling programs. However, one of the things I learned that I found fascinating, and this is from touring the Wheelbrader incinerator in Baltimore, they admitted to me that they compete more with composting, because their boilers are rated at a certain amount of BTUs per hour, a certain amount of energy value they can put into it. And because of like the water bottles we see on the tables, a lot of things that used to be packaged more responsibly, like in glass, are increasingly now packaged in plastic. There's a lot more plastic in the waste stream. And incinerator companies are not liking that so much, because when they hit a certain amount of energy value, they can't put more waste through their boilers. Their boilers are not rated to accept that. So they would rather have things like your food scraps that ought to be composted, because that wet stuff doesn't burn as well, and that means they can accept more tons and get paid per ton more each day. And so that it never occurred to me. I thought that was fascinating to understand that there's this competition in both directions, depending on which incinerator, how much plastic and stuff they have, but they can be more sometimes in competition with doing the right thing on organics and recycling. They have to be fed a certain amount of waste or they can't economically compete, so that's another important thing to know, and we already talked about that. So good. All right, I won't go through this in detail, but just know there are many examples. I mentioned Claremont already. Harrisburg, Pennsylvania is one I worked on very closely several years ago. Bankrupted I'm from Pennsylvania, bankrupted the capital city of Pennsylvania because of the debt from the incinerator. I warned them 8 years before that happened, that's what was going to happen if they invested more money in that incinerator, and then 8 years later in 2011, it happened, and I got to say I told you so, but it didn't feel very good. Okay, lots of other examples, but we'll move on. So, jobs. Incinerators are the worst way to create jobs. So they're losing on all the fronts so far, right? So in this study that came out from the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, and there's a newer one I'll tell you about in a second, but it creates about one job if you landfill or incinerate for 10,000 tons of material per year processed. You get about 10 times that just a recycling sorting center. Go on. This is the same data, just broken out in more detail. So the recycling sorting centers, they call them MRFs, it rhymes with Smurf. It's a material recovery facility. But certain things, like reusing computers, almost 300 times as many jobs for the same amount of material. And if you burn it, you're just destroying that material, destroying the job creating capacity as well. A more recent study the same group did found that in Maryland, when they analyzed it with more recent data, they found that landfills actually produce about 83% more jobs than incinerators. Of course, doing the right thing, recycling, you get still about 10 times more, 5 to 10 times with composting. But even switching straight to landfilling, you get more jobs. So they even do this against landfills on that. Okay. All right, so earlier I said we'll compare them to coal plants. The industry hates this comparison. They hate this because part of their drive has been in justifying themselves how they're energy facilities. They're not waste facilities anymore, they're energy from waste again, from Baltimore. They tried to build a third incinerator in that city. It would have been the biggest one in the country, 4,000 tons per day. And they were going to build it within a mile of a school, which is illegal in Maryland. There's a law, state law that says you can't do that. So they said, we're not an incinerator, we're a power plant. And the state bought that, which is ridiculous, but they bought it, and they let them go ahead and build it within a mile of a high school. And the high school students led the battle and actually stopped that. But in things like that, and other examples as well, it's critical for this industry to not be waste facilities anymore, but all of a sudden be power plants. So when you compare them to power plants, you say, okay, you're a power plant, let's see how you compare to the dirtiest thing that we all know in general is out there producing energy, and that's nuclear power too. Wow, it just flows off my tongue. But coal is also the dirtiest in a different way of measuring. So if you compare them to coal, which I did with the latest available data several years ago. Most of this is around 2005 data. I'm going to rerun the newer numbers now that they're out. But the best data that was available nationally for the whole industry, and found that on every one of these measures, burning trash is dirtier than coal for producing the same amount of energy. And so, of course, coal plants are much bigger, so they put out more usually. But if they were producing the same amount of energy, you get 28 times more dioxins, the most toxic chemicals known to science. 6 to 14 times as much mercury. The 14 numbers from the state government of New York. They actually put that out. It wasn't me or some activist deciding what the number is and calculating EPA data. It was the government of New York. They said it's 14 times as bad as their coal plants. So you can see on all of these, even carbon dioxide, 2.5 times as bad as coal, and that's EPA's own data. This is the same thing, just so you can see it more visually as a ratio. So when I presented that, the mouthpiece for the incinerator industry admitted that I was right by dodging it and saying all of a sudden, you can't compare us to energy facilities. Well, you can't compare us to coal plants. We're primarily waste facilities. Electric generation is a secondary function. So all of a sudden, they're waste facilities again once you compare them to coal. Go ahead. All right, so the EPA data that I crunched on global warming. Now, mind you, EPA speaks out of 3 sides of their mouth on this topic. You can go to 3 different parts of their website and find completely different data on each of them. But what I did is I went to the raw data, that some of their data supposedly came from, and I drilled into that and looked at all the coal plants, all the incinerators that had comparable data in the country, and this is what we found. 2.5 times as much CO2 coming out as you get from coal plants for the same amount of energy. Now, they play a lot of games with this. The first game they play is they say, oh, this part doesn't matter. But your state is the one that just proved that. Your state looked at a study, they hired the Manomet Center for Conservation Sciences and looked at wood burning, biomass, power plants. And they asked the question, is burning wood carbon neutral? You know, because trees regrow, right? So we shouldn't count that carbon if you put it in the air because it's just going to get sucked up by more trees, right? And what your state found when it hired that science outfit to research it, that this extra pulse is 50% worse than coal for just burning trees, which a lot of that stuff, paper, ends up in incinerators too. So that extra pulse of CO2, it takes an average of about 45 years for that to get down to the level of coal. That's not carbon neutral, that's equal to coal in 45 years, if you plant new trees and don't cut them down in that time. Of course, that's not really happening a lot of times. But even if it is, that means it's going to be as bad as coal in 45 years. If we're talking about global warming, we don't have 45 years. So this idea that this is carbon neutral, that this part, the paper and food scrap part of what's in trash doesn't count, is nonsense. It definitely is. Stuff is CO2 going into the air, and the atmosphere doesn't think, well, that's a biogenic CO2 molecule, so I won't heat that one up, but I'll heat that one up because that came from burning plastic. That's ridiculous, right? So we have to take this seriously. All right. So the most toxic chemicals known to science are these molecules right here. That's a dioxin molecule. No one makes this stuff on purpose, but how many of you have family members or ever knew someone in Vietnam? Okay, see, a good number of hands. There were a lot of people that got contaminated from Agent Orange in Vietnam, and a lot of us know the word dioxin because of that. Dioxin was contaminating the pesticide combination. Those two pesticides they combined to make Agent Orange, and dioxin was a contaminant in that because it's a very similar chemical. Dioxins are very dangerous. They are the most toxic chemicals known to science that are human-made. They cause so many problems. These are just some of them. I could fill a slide with small print of all the things dioxins cause. And 93% of what we get exposed to is from meat and dairy products because it loves fat and it hates water. It climbs up the food chain. Go to the next slide. So this chart is from EPA. This is where you get your dioxin from. So it starts from things like incinerators and certain chemical processes like making pesticides out of chlorine. But it gets to us through our diet. So if you're not vegan, and this slide actually made me go from vegetarian to vegan, to be honest. Seeing how much of this very toxic chemical is something we're feeding ourselves all the time, thinking that our food is safe. And this is not something you can avoid by going organic because these toxic chemicals don't skip over organic farm fields. So sorry to bust that bubble. Okay. All right, so why do I have a speeding race car on here? There's a standard line you'll get from any company with a smokestack. And I want to ask you when I explain this to raise your hand and tell me if you've heard this here. People I've never even heard from before call me up from like Kansas and say, they're trying to build this thing here. And I'm like, did they say this? They're like, that's exactly what they said. So this is all over. They say, don't worry. We're going to have continuous emissions monitors. We'll know what's coming out of our smokestack at all times. The state will have this data. And trust us, if we go over that limit, they'll fine us very hard. So of course we won't do that. And that limit means it's healthy and safe. Have you heard this before?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so you're not alone. So I'm going to undress the emperor that wears no clothes in that statement because every part of that is misleading, and knowing how to take it apart can make you sound really dangerous in public meetings. So first of all, the limits don't mean health and safety. They're not based on health and safety. There was once a public hearing where they were trying to build an ethanol biorefinery 8 miles from another one the same size, but they were going to burn different fuels, waste coal in one and natural gas in another. And one of the permits had allowable levels that were 6 times higher than the other. And I asked in that meeting, if these permit limits mean health and safety, how come what's healthy and safe is 6 times different 8 miles away? And they couldn't evade that. So the person running the State Department of Environmental Protection in Pennsylvania in that meeting admitted on video, I have this video, that's not based on health and safety, that these permits are technology-based standards based on what they're able to meet economically. It's not something where they're pouring over and back, okay, well, this level won't hurt anyone, so we'll only do that. Because if they did that, they would also look at, gee, well, let's not put 3 of these plants next to each other, like they have in your county. Essex County is one of 2 counties in the whole country where you have 3 trash incinerators in one county. It blew my mind when I found that out. So it's not based on health and safety. It's also not the case that they get fined heavily when they do get fined. And so it's like a slap on the wrist when they do. It's like the cost of business, because companies will violate something, pay a fine to the state, and then keep operating as they normally do, and they'll violate something again, they'll pay a fine to the state, and that's just how they work. I've been in enough file rooms to see the records to know that that's the case. But the reason this is up here is because when they say we're continuously monitoring something, the biggest way to undress the emperor wearing no clothes is to ask them, which things are you continuously monitoring? Which pollutants? So I've toured these plants. I haven't toured this one, I've toured other wheelbrader incinerators and other ones. And they have a control room that looks like NASA. They have all these screens, and it looks like they really know what they're doing. But when you ask them simple questions of like, well, which pollutants are you monitoring? Are you continuously monitoring for mercury? Like, do you know how much mercury is coming out right now? They have no idea. Dioxin, any toxic metal, acid gases, most things they have no idea because they're not looking. Go ahead to the next slide. Except for 3 pollutants that are typical that they monitor on a continuous basis. Sometimes you'll be lucky and get a 4th. Maybe it's hydrogen chloride, hydrochloric acid, or CO2 instead of just carbon monoxide. But for the most part, all these things, especially all these toxic chemicals you see in here, they test them once a year at best. And the reason why that speeding car on the previous slide is if we regulated people driving on the road, the way we regulate smokestacks, we would let people drive around all year with no speedometer, and once a year we would set a speed trap on the highways, and we'd have warning signs that say, warning, slow down, speed trap ahead. And the brother of the driver would be running the speed trap because they run their own tests. That is what's really going on, and it's appalling when you think of it in those terms, because you realize that this technology exists. These continuous emissions monitors were tested and verified by EPA over 10 years ago. And no one, except for a few places where I've written local laws and gotten the passed, no one is requiring industry to use modern technology to test what's coming out of their smokestacks so they actually know what they're putting into your air. They don't know, except for a few things. And they will do this best behavior test 1 day a year, and sometimes they'll still fail it, which is ridiculous. It's like failing an open book test. But usually they pass it because it's hard to fail a test when you know it's coming and you're running it yourself and you're under the best operating conditions, because sometimes they even manipulate the trash they burn. There are incinerators that have been caught putting one part of the town's trash to the side and burning the part of the town that they thought had cleaner trash in the days that are coming before their test. This has been exposed in Columbus, Ohio, is from that example. I'm sure there are others. This is just the one that we've gotten information from. So this happens. Go ahead. All right. So incinerators are worse than landfills. And Kirsten might want to kill me on this because landfills are terrible too. I'm not a cheerleader for landfills. I fought a lot of landfills. But we have to be real about the fact that putting 70% of the waste into your air and then turning the rest into ash and putting it in your landfill, that's not doing anyone favors. It's not better. So it's not even incinerators versus landfills. It's incinerators, basically landfills versus both, because you still have to put the ash somewhere. It still goes to a landfill like the one you have. Go ahead. Or we can do the right thing, zero waste, and minimize landfill. Go ahead. So a little bit about the ash. The reason why I have coffee beans up here is that when you pour water over coffee beans, do you get coffee?
No.
But if you grind them up and you increase the surface area, you get coffee, right? Well, if you put rainwater through an ash landfill, after you burned all that trash and turned it into ash, that's much higher surface area, you're going to get leachate, right? You're going to get a lot of toxins in there. If I took this phone and I try to breathe or eat the toxic metals that are in here, it's going to be pretty hard for me to do that, right? If I truck this in a landfill, it's going to take a long time for the toxic metals or for the brominated or chlorinated flame retardants or plastics that are in here to get me and hurt me in some way. But if I put that in an incinerator instantly, some of those are going in your air. Those that don't, so if they have better, more expensive pollution controls, your ash just becomes more toxic because you're just moving those toxins from the air to the ash. You put it in a form that's easily captured by rainwater and leached out of an ash landfill. It also can blow into the community when they put it on top of the landfill as landfill cover. So that's even a more dangerous form. So it doesn't have to go through the groundwater and eventually get you. It can get you much more quickly. And the combustion process changes things too. So the chlorine, the fluorine, the bromine, those halogen chemicals, if you remember back to the chemistry class, the ones next to the noble gases that react really well to things, they form very toxic compounds like dioxins and furans, like hydrochloric acid, hydrofluoric acid, very dangerous things that aren't here right now. They're not here. But if you burn them, they get formed in the combustion process and they end up in the air and the ash. So it's far worse to have an ash landfill than even a bigger landfill full of trash. All right, I won't belabor this, or did you want me to get into this? Since you have an ash landfill here.
It's-
Sorry.
We talk about it every time, but you could definitely say it quickly. Yeah, there's an issue.
All right. They will insist that their ash is not hazardous waste.
How many times have we heard that?
Right?
Constantly.
They are manipulating the science on this, and EPA is helping them do this. Back in 1995, I think it was, there was a case of Environmental Defense Fund versus Chicago that went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said to EPA, you can't keep calling trash incinerator ash special waste and not let it be considered hazardous waste. You actually have to test the stuff. And if it tests hazardous, it's hazardous. No word games. So what did they do? They changed the test. So instead of using a test that used to show that the fly ash, the stuff they capture in the pollution controls, would be hazardous about 90% of the time. The bottom ash that's on the conveyor belt would test hazardous about 40% of the time. So they did a few things. They let them combine them so that the larger volume of bottom ash protects the fly ash and dilutes it. They also inject lime in the pollution controls, so that changes the pH of the test. They also changed the test to change the pH so that certain things that usually fail the test all the time, like lead and cadmium, stop failing the test. For example, lead is a U-shaped solubility curve. So if you get too acid or too basic, too acidic or too basic, it's going to be a high level of leaching. But if you're in a neutral area like water, pH 7, you don't see much leaching at all. So what they do is they adjusted the test, even though it's supposed to simulate acid rain over time. They adjusted it so that it's at that right pH where it doesn't leach out. So when you do this test in the laboratory, gee, the ash is fine, it's not hazardous. You can send it to a normal landfill and not pay a lot more money to ship it all the way to a much more expensive hazardous waste landfill. If they had to dispose of this stuff as hazardous waste, this industry would be dead overnight, and they know it. And that's why they bend over backwards, and I didn't describe all the tricks. There's some other chemistry tricks too. But there are about 4 or 5 different things that they do to be able to pass the test that they shouldn't be passing. Other countries treat this like hazardous waste. In Europe, some countries actually put it into salt mines and encase it like they would nuclear waste. And here you put it on a landfill in a marsh where it can blow into the community. I mean, it's just appalling that they do this. All right, so we did a life cycle analysis. So for DC, we're trying to convince the city to stop using one of the biggest incinerators in the country. And we actually studied this. We looked at not just some of the, like the cost and who's impacted, the economic and social criteria, but we looked at 10 different environmental criteria. And by most of those criteria, it turned out that even if you truck the waste 4 times as far to get to a landfill, it's better for the environment to do that than to burn it closer to home, because the emissions are just that extreme from trash burning. Go ahead. This is just the results slide of those 10. You can see the yellow is the incinerator option, and the 2 landfill options, depending on the distance and the time period you look at it, are the blue and red lines. On most of these, the yellow line is taller, and that's because the incinerator option turned out to be dirtier. And on the few things where the incinerator option turned out to be less dirty, they're very small units. They're things that aren't as much of an impact as the things that are coming out worse for incinerators. Okay, so I put this in because it's just such a powerful slide. I visited the community. This is where DC's waste gets burned, in Lorton, Virginia. It doesn't usually get burned like this. This is when the plant was on fire because they had 3 stories of trash indoors in their tipping floor that caught fire, and they couldn't put it out for 2 weeks. I was there with a gas mask on, or a filter mask, 2 days into this fire, walking around the community that's right next to it. Kids playing in the playground, people, like, kids with asthma that can't breathe, neighbors complaining to me, and it was tragic seeing what was going on there. But this, when they testified before DC City Council, they admitted that this is becoming more prevalent. This fire happened 2 months, two and a half months after another 2-week-long fire happened nearby in Montgomery County, Maryland, same company. And at that one, go ahead, they did a report for the county, and they showed this is the newest incinerator in the country, except for this expanded one in Florida, is that 22-year-old one in Montgomery County, Maryland. They had 6 fires in just a 2-year span. But the rest of their 40-plant fleet, most of them had fires that required an off-site emergency response. So, I mean, this is a company, these are industries that should be good at containing fire, but apparently they can't do that. And they can only guess what's causing it. They think it's lithium batteries in waste piles, but it could be people throwing smoldering things out. But regardless, having accidents like this is becoming more and more routine, and they're admitting that's the case. Okay, go on. So this is just a summary slide for some of the things we found in studies of the health effects on communities with trash incinerators. Of course, you expect asthma to be higher, and it often is, but a lot of cancers as well, birth defects, even the dioxin levels in the blood of incinerator workers has been found to be higher. All right, so I promised I would talk a little bit more about environmental justice, as otherwise known as environmental racism. This is my friend Zulie Mayfield from Chester, Pennsylvania. They live with the largest trash incinerator in the country, 3,500 tons per day. Twice, her group's office in the 90s was broken into. Once they wrote KKK on the wall, so in case it wasn't obvious, that made it very obvious that it's not just because people are poor. What we found, go to the next slide. We analyzed this, and we found that of most of the industries that we've looked at, this is one of the more extreme examples where you find communities of color being disproportionately impacted. This is an analysis we did based on about 80 some incinerators in the country, all the ones that were operating at the time we ran this a few years ago. It's on this Justice Map project that we have. And all these different distances aggregated from all the incinerators in the country, you see if things were equally distributed, these would all be on the one line. But white people are actually less impacted than would be fair where these are located. Black folks actually have the worst impact. So, I mean, no, I'm talking to a very white audience right now, but I'm not shy about pointing out that these often get away existing where they are because they're in communities that have a lot of people of color living in them. And they get away with it because they think these communities don't have the political power to fight back. And sometimes they're right. And maybe that's why it got cited here in the first place. I don't know the history of the citing here, but maybe that has something to do with it. But this is an industry that, this is not just here, this is a trend that we see, especially in this specific industry, which is why they've been sensitive to these criticisms and talk about environmental justice and act like they're doing something about it, but they can't do something about it unless they're going to shut down. And no one's saying to reopen somewhere else. They don't belong anywhere. But this is just a real dynamic of what's going on, and what we found is that race is more of a factor than class. It's not just because communities are poor, it's because there are communities that are like the one with the fire I just showed you, is that are affluent communities of color that are still ending up being host to these kinds of dangerous facilities. So that's just what we see as a trend. Go on. All right, so a little bit on zero waste, and then Kiersey's going to cover this in more depth. Go ahead. So this is the old definition. There's a shorter definition now. I'll email that out to the folks that sign up so you have it. But if you go to zwia.org, that's the Zero Waste International Alliance, they define what zero waste means internationally. And zero waste means you don't burn anything, and you reduce the amount that goes to landfills by at least 90%. The goal is to get as close to zero as possible, so it doesn't mean literal zero. That is impossible. We know that. We're not crazy idealists. We realize that we need to get there and we have to aim for something. And a lot of places start and say, well, let's have a goal of recycling 35% or 60%. It's like, when you look at industry's other practices, and we have things like zero drug tolerance or zero accidents in the workplace, what company goes out and sets the standard and says, we aim to injure 5 workers per year? right? Like, that's ridiculous. And of course it gets left out of the room. So why are we any different with waste? How much waste do you want to have? Zero. So if you set the policy of getting as close to zero, that means you don't stop trying to get to that very last bit. You don't get content that you've gotten 60% recycled and compost and then you just keep having landfills for about 40. You just keep trying. And some communities have gotten 80, 90% diversion from incinerators and landfills. And we could do that here too. We just need to try hard enough. And the first step in that is you stop subsidizing and feeding the most expensive polluting option that you can have. All right, so I won't get into all this. There's a lot of value in your waste. That's what this slide means. Go ahead. It's just an example from Austin where they set a good plan. Go ahead. That gets them at 90% diversion by 2040, and with very high goals there. So if they could do this in Texas, I know it's like the Berkeley of Texas, but still, if they could do this in Texas, you could do it in Massachusetts. Go ahead. This is what the zero waste hierarchy looks like. I know Kirsty has this in her presentation, so she'll get into it more. But if you have questions later about like how do you get the back end of it right, that's been my specialty. I helped design this, and this is used as a standard internationally. This just explains some more about how that works. Okay, let me just make this point, and then I'll be wrapping up. So you have a landfill at the end of the pipe no matter what you do. You have three basic options on the back end. First is you can directly landfill. Now, of course, we're not fans of landfills. We know that's bad. Landfills are gassy and stinky. They're bad for global warming. They poison groundwater. There shouldn't be any question about them being a problem. Incineration just spends more money to put a lot of it in your air and make your landfill more toxic. It'll be smaller, but it's not the size that kills people. It's the toxicity. So we don't want this as the alternative. If on the back end, after we do the reduce, reuse, recycle, and composting as much as we can and never stop getting that as close to zero as you can, you still have to figure out how do you deal with that stuff, because there's always something that's left. And there's going to be a landfill of some sort that goes to. So the question is, how do we manage that? And I think the way we manage it is, first of all, you don't have landfills in marshes. That's just dumb. So don't do that. Wherever the landfill is, that's going to be the unfortunate place where the waste from this region goes. You want to pull extra recyclables out, and you want to stabilize the organic fraction that's left, like a digestion type process. They're doing this in San Francisco. They're doing something similar in Halifax, Nova Scotia. They're two of the best examples I know of in North America. And that way, you're getting the gases out in a system that, like the digester, that is more enclosed. You can capture those gases, whereas with an open air landfill, you can't capture it all very well. And so this avoids having the gassy, stinky landfill. You'll have a much more stable landfill with a small amount of stuff in it if you do it right. All right, so skip that. So it's basically the same thing. Here's just some websites for more information. Don't try to copy this all down now. We'll send it out by email. Next one. So just go here, write down my information if you want to ask any questions. Thanks for giving me so much time. And let's pass it on to Kirsten.
My name is Kirsty Pecci. I'm at the Conservation Law Foundation. I am going to be very brief because I think that Mary and Mike have already covered most of what we need to talk about tonight. So if I could have another hand for them, they've done a fantastic job. Made my flight very, very easy. It's like you've already had a great appetizer and a great meal. You just want a tiny cookie for dessert. So we're going to keep it moving right along. Conservation Law Foundation is a nonprofit organization. I think of us as a nonprofit law firm. We work to use science, the market, and the law to protect public health. That's what we do. And we've been in existence since the 1960s, I think 66. So, all right, so very, very quickly, municipal solid waste is hazardous, as Mike had talked about. I'm going to talk about landfills and incinerators, more underscoring what he already said, and then talk mostly about zero waste solutions. Waste in Massachusetts, what we're talking about for how much waste we have in Massachusetts, and then some specifics about Wheelabrator, Saugus, incinerator, and ash landfill, and what's going into the incinerator there. And how can we fix this problem in Massachusetts? Because we have really good ways of doing that that will save us money, protect our health, and create jobs. Okay, so what's in the MSW? Remember, and you can actually just go right to the end of the slide if you want, Mary. So remember that MSW, municipal solid waste, is all the trash from everywhere, okay? We're not just talking about your household trash, we're talking about industrial trash, commercial trash, business trash, the nail salon, the automotive place, unless it's called hazardous waste, which means it's very, very concentrated, it's in your municipal solid waste. And all the contaminants that you find in hazardous waste are also in your municipal solid waste, just in a less concentrated form. Think of hazardous waste as barrels of hazards, that kind of concentrated waste, whereas municipal solid waste is all those same contaminants, but just sprinkled throughout all of your regular trash. Next one, please. So what's in there? Heavy metals, VOCs, volatile organic compounds. All the contaminants that you're concerned about, radioactive materials, literally tens of thousands of dangerous contaminants. That's 85,000 is the number that EPA uses. That is really, really much fewer contaminants that are actually in our waste. And we, in the United States, we do not test our contaminants before we use them or use them in a product. We use them first, and then if they make people sick and we can prove that they've made people sick, then we regulate them. So very few, and I'm talking like a couple hundred, of these contaminants are regulated in any meaningful way. So it's out there, and it's making us all sick, and it's in our waste. Okay, landfills. All landfills, and you can go right through Mary again. All landfills, as Mike said, are very dangerous. They are maybe not quite as bad as incinerators, but I would argue that the only reason they're not as bad as incinerators is that incinerators mean incinerators plus landfills. Every landfill creates methane because we've got an enclosed surface where you've got waste, soil, and there's no air in it, and then rains, right? So as soon as you have water and the carbon materials like food or cardboard or paper, and no air, that creates methane. Methane is a flammable gas that's a very dangerous greenhouse gas, and it drags all those contaminants out into the air. So methane, landfill gas, is not only methane, but it's also a lot of those contaminants we're concerned about. Every landfill leaks. They put a liner down, they put some trash down, they put another liner system. It's only a matter of time before it breaks down and leaks. And that's a plastic liner system. The landfill here in Saugus does not even have a plastic liner system. That landfill was built in the 1950s, and they started putting MSW down, and then they started adding ash in the 1970s. So best case scenario, maybe you can get 10 or 20 years of non-leaking in a landfill cell. I would argue that that's usually a pipe dream too. This case, there was never a plastic liner. So while this is a legal landfill, it was allowed to be put there, it's not something that's being shut down right now. That doesn't mean it's a safe landfill. This is just a pictorial representation of what I'm talking about. They collect the leachate in pipes, they collect the gas in pipes, but unfortunately that doesn't mean it's not also escaping. And especially with the leachate, even if they collect it, they bring it to a wastewater treatment plant. Wastewater treatment plants are designed to deal with human waste. They are not designed to deal with those 85,000 chemicals that I talked about. So the effluent, what comes out of a wastewater treatment plant, is not tested for those contaminants. It's just tested for a few things that are not in leachate. So that is a system, even best case scenario, the leachate that's captured, or I think of it as garbage coffee, so it's funny you use the coffee example, Mike, is unsafe and breaks down our wastewater treatment plants and ends up in our rivers like the Saugus River. Okay, incinerators, as Mike already said, dangerous, dangerous, dangerous. I don't even need to say this all. They're dangerous air emissions, incinerator ash. They still require landfills. They're expensive. They're a waste of energy, as Mike said, and resources. They're terrible for jobs. And in Massachusetts, we're incinerating over 3 million tons of waste a year. Okay, we have other alternatives. This is a definition of zero waste. The conservation of all resources by means of responsible production, consumption, reuse, and recovery of all products, packaging, and materials without burning them and without discharges to land, water, or air that threaten the environment or human. We have to start designing our products so that product, that after we use it, can become that becomes the new materials that we use to make the next product. That's how we have to design things. Instead of designing a product to be thrown away, to be used for a few seconds, the way many of our products are now, that single-use mentality, we have to design products so we can use them again. And only then are we going to be able to achieve this. And we have to start regulating, and when we have discharges to land into the air, we have to be honest about it, and we have to make these companies accountable for what they're doing. All right, what's not zero waste is any type of high heat or dry tomb landfilling. It's not a lifestyle choice. Everybody in this room can do the best they can, but there are going to be times where you can only get a product in a plastic bag, where you can only get what you need, unfortunately, in a container that's not recyclable. Even Mike, who is really one of the best zero waste lifestyle people I know, every once in a while ends up using something that needs to be disposed of. And even if you're recycling and composting, that takes energy. Until the system is set up so that we're really creating the circular economy, you should keep trying. You should do the best you can, but understand that you can only go so far. And we might all be part of the problem, but we can be part of the solution. We need to change the system, though, to solve it. We have to buy better, but we also have to push the system so it evolves. Mike already talked about this. The reason I like this hierarchy is because right up top, you see rethink and redesign. Then reduce, okay? Reduction is where the money is at. That's where it's at. If you put, for instance, a pay-as-you-throw or save money and reduce trash system in your community, a study just came out from UNH, you will reduce your trash by 40 to 50%. And these are communities in New Hampshire that they were comparing, okay? They can do it in New Hampshire. We can do it here. Never mind, Texas. So that is saving real money, because disposal is really expensive. Recycling is expensive too, and then composting is less expensive. Recycling goes up and down, but what we really need to do first is reduce, so we're not spending any of that money. And as I said before, that redesign part is really important, or we're never going to get to the circular economy. Then reuse. The more times you use something, and when you think about reuse, think about bottles being used over again. Think about bringing a cloth bag to the grocery store. The more you reuse something, the more that embodied energy that Mike was talking about gets captured and appreciated. If you use something once and dispose of it, then it does have to be made again. If you reuse it over and over again, then you're getting your money's worth, and the world's getting their money's worth. Their energy worth is how I would think of it. Recycling and compost, then material recovery, and then you have to deal with your residuals. This sounds dramatic and pie in the sky. This sounds really impossible to reach. Nantucket's at 90%. Nantucket is at 90% diversion right now, okay? They've been banning plastic bags and other non-recyclable goods. They've been composting things, and now they've got a new program where if you're bringing something on the island, you have to take it off. Now, Nantucket is an island, but really we have to think of the whole world this way as an island, right? We've got to start thinking about it and being tough on these products. And you know why Nantucket is doing this? They had a very small landfill that was filling up, and the cost to ship it off island was so high that they had to do this. We have to make our waste disposal that expensive. That's one of the levers for change at CLF. Waste disposal should be that expensive because it's making everybody sicker. And we can't put a price on that the way I would like to. So we have to start being realistic about that and putting a realistic price on each ton of disposal. And once we acknowledge that, we pretend we're all Nantucket and we can do a much better job. If they can do this, then we most certainly can. In Massachusetts, these materials are not allowed right now to go into landfills or incinerators. And yet they are all the time. Mass DEP estimates that over 2 million tons a year of materials are going into landfills and incinerators that are part of this list. Mass DEP also has a waste ban on commercial food waste. I'm not even including that in the 2 million tons. And instead of us decreasing how much waste we're throwing away every year, I just got back from a meeting last week with Mass DEP. 2017, our numbers are up again by another 100,000 tons a year of what we're disposing in the state. We're not doing what we need to do to shut down dangerous facilities like the incinerator in Saugus, like the landfills that are around the state, and also to make sure we're not shipping it out of state. As I said, 5.7 million tons of waste are disposed of in 2017. More than 2 million tons were waistband items, according to how DEP calculates the waistbands. Another 2 million tons were items that US EPA would consider recyclable or compostable. That's money just being thrown away, folks. That is disgusting. So there are 4 to 5 million tons a year that could be recycled or composted in this state that we're not doing. We're not doing it. Now, we have made some strides in food waste. Mass DEP put a commercial food waste ban in place, and if your commercial entity or institution creates more than a ton of food waste a week, then you're captured by this. And what Mass DEP did was incentivize composting facilities and anaerobic digestion facilities, and then they also sent consultants out to work with these hospitals, schools, big institutions, and big businesses to find ways of cutting down their food waste. BC cut their food waste so much that they saved, I think it was $140,000 a year because they decreased their food waste. And so we've started doing that, and it's working in Massachusetts. But this is the only place we've really seen the needle move. So in 2014, we were diverting about 150,000 tons a year. As of the end of 2016, it was 260,000 tons a year. So that food is now feeding people, or there's been reduction, or they're feeding animals, or it's being composted or processed in an anaerobic digester. We can do this not only with food. We've got about another 1 million tons of food a year that we should be doing this with. We can do this also, say, for instance, with cardboard. And I'm going to get to that in a second. All right, so this is the Wheelabrator incinerator in Saugus, as we talked about. And there it is again. I think it's the same slide that Mary used. All right. And this is what Mike was talking about. There's a reason that the incinerator is right there. And it's because this is an environmental justice population here. There's environmental justice population in Saugus, and then here in Revere. This incinerator would not be located here, right? We know that, okay? That's not right. And that's another reason for us to fight against this. Now, Saugus has to report every 3 years, Wheelabrator Saugus, as to what they are burning. It's called their waste characterization study. You'll see here, organics, 36.8%. That should be composted, folks, right? Up top, paper. Most of that is cardboard because we're not using newspapers anymore. That's mostly cardboard, 22.8%. Cardboard is a cash crop. The businesses and homes that are throwing away cardboard, that's just a waste of money. That should be a place where we're making money, even in this depressed recycling market. Textiles, 5.4%. Now, many times textiles are as much as 10%. This is a snapshot. I wouldn't be surprised if it's more than that. In Massachusetts, a couple different businesses have begun a program where they'll ask you to put your textiles in a purple bag and they'll pick them up on trash day and pay the town $20 a ton. They pick them up for free because textiles are so recyclable, 97% recyclable. They get reused and they get recycled. Glass, metals, and then half the plastics are also recyclable. About half the C and D, construction demolition materials, are recyclable. So what we're talking about here, I see opportunity. I see the low-hanging fruit, as I told Mike, of organics, where we should be making money and creating jobs in the state. Cardboard, again, making money. Textiles, making money. And then the recyclables, we can be increasing our recycling, and also we can be reducing this whole pie so that we're not talking about 5.7 million tons a year. We can be cutting that right down with good incentive programs. So what I'm trying to do with the Zero Waste Project at CLF is, first of all, stop the expansion of dangerous facilities, because when you create it, as Mike said, you got to feed the beast, right? If there's an incinerator, they put contracts in place so that they get the trash. You're never going to reduce that trash. You're never going to divert it to composting and recycling programs if those facilities exist. And it's true of landfills as well. we're working very hard to lobby for zero waste legislation, like the legislation that Representative Vincent was talking about earlier, some of which is focused on facilities, and then also to start banning some of the dangerous plastics and to incentivize the best zero waste practices like pay-as-you-throw that reduce how much waste we're creating in the state. We need to get the existing laws enforced. Those regulations, those waste ban regulations, at last I heard, there are 1.5 full-time employees doing waste ban inspection across the state. According to Mass DEP, they need about 4 or 5 people working full-time on that. That is not an impossible task. That's a very small request to hire a few people to be at the landfills, transfer stations, and incinerators and make sure that long list of waste ban items don't go in the trash, right, and don't get in those facilities. We need to be doing a better job with that, for instance. We need good numbers. I can tell you what's happening in most residential programs, and I can tell you what's happening across the state. I don't know what's happening in the business sector. I don't have numbers for that. And if I don't have numbers, and I'm getting my numbers from SDP, they don't have numbers. If we don't know what we're doing, we can't track it and we can't improve, right? We have to be doing a better job with all those numbers. And we need to keep working statewide, and also we're expanding to work now New England-wide on these issues because our waste now is going to Turnkey, New Hampshire. It's going to Rochester, New Hampshire, because their waste management's trying to expand the landfill there. Waste management's also trying to expand the landfill into Leominster Forest, part of Westminster that's actually in the forest. They want to take that land out of Article 97, the conservation land, and make it part of the landfill in Fitchburg, Westminster. So they will go there and they will do it. And then finally, we're working with communities across the state and New England on zero waste plans and programs because the city of Boston is going there with zero waste. They've got a plan that they're going to be evaluating this winter. Hopefully they'll be adopting it and hopefully they'll be enforcing it because we need that evaluation, enforcement, and then start over again, over and over again. So that's what our plan is at CLF to keep doing this. And we want to keep working with groups like this one because we need to hear from you folks how we can make this happen locally. We can't go into communities unless the community is fighting. So I want to thank all of you for working on these issues and being aware of these issues and standing up for yourself because you hear these lies over and over again that it's a safe facility and that it's okay because it's a legal facility. Safe does not equal legal, right? It truly doesn't. I was at a meeting a couple months ago and I said no incinerators is safe, and the guy who works at Wheelabrator said, I resent that. I've been working there 20 years to make sure we conform with the regulations. I said, you conform with the regulations, it's not safe. And so that's why we need to keep working to do better. And this is costing us a lot of money. So as much as I'm an idealist, the most pragmatic thing you can do in the world is reduce your waste and find better ways of making this economy work. As Mike said, please give me a call if you need anything. Please take my card. Everything that I've talked about, I can get you resources for so you have information about it. And thank you so much, Mary and Mike. You guys were great tonight, and I think they've covered most of it, and I think that was just the frosting. So now, time for questions. Okay? All right. Okay. Questions?
Yeah,
Sir.
I got a question. We know there's a fire in California that burnt out of towns already. Now, we don't know if chemicals were burned or anything like that. Now, if this ever happened in Saugus and Revere, and this place went up, the incinerator, is there an evacuation plan, number one? And what's in the toxic chemicals that people are gonna be breathing in? And we know that the fire from California, the smoke is coming towards Massachusetts. That's what I heard on the news. So this toxic chemical here can go somewhere else. So we need to close this thing down as soon as possible before it does, in case we do have a big fire like California has, and we get trapped into this thing. And I only live across the street from the thing, so.
Do we know how many fires, I know there was at least 2 fires at the incinerator
Yeah.
last year. I mean, so it's not something that hasn't happened at this incinerator.
Right.
Mike, do you want to talk a little bit about the the dangers around those kinds of fires?
First, just on the, do you want to address the evacuation piece with the roads after or should I just?
I mean, I don't know much about that, but.
All I know is what I learned tonight, that you have 2 highways that access to that area, and that there were, I think, 3 times in the past year that they flooded, you just told me earlier. So that means you can't evacuate it. If you have workers there, or if you have a fire company that needs to get there, if that's gonna continue to happen more often as we have more extreme weather events, that's a concern in its own right. If it had a fire on the scale of what they had in Montgomery County, Maryland, or Fairfax County, Virginia, where you have 2-week-long fire of a waste pile they can't control, I could tell you from experiencing those 2 situations myself, being in those communities when those fires were happening, they don't know what's coming out. You had the fire marshal in the one that I showed you the picture of, that was the worst fire. The fire marshal for Fairfax County told the press, there's nothing to worry about in terms of health problems because it's only household trash burning. That is ridiculous on so many levels. First of all, because it's also industrial waste burning. But why would they need 4 pollution control devices and state regulations if household trash burning, uncontrolled completely, is somehow safe? And that's just ludicrous on its face, but that's what they told the press. Of course, they also put in the press that said recycling plant on fire, not trash incinerator on fire. So they deliberately miseducate or confuse the public in this. They don't know, like I said with the continuous monitors, they don't know what's coming out of the smokestack that they can put devices on, except for a few pollutants on a continuous basis. So do you think they know what's coming out of an uncontrolled 3-story trash pile fire? No, they don't. In Montgomery County, which is a little more affluent, in that case, they at least responded to it a little bit better, and after a while, of this 2-week-long fire, they were like, maybe we should get some air testing equipment from another jurisdiction that has it. And they called around, and close to the end of the fire, they brought in some equipment that could start to test things, but I mean, that's 2 weeks into a fire. So they don't have the equipment on site, and they're not testing for everything, and they can't test for everything, because everything is a lot of chemicals. There's no device that tests for everything. So they don't know what's coming out. All we know intuitively and from common sense is that it's a lot of stuff and it's dangerous. And that's just obvious from so many levels. So I'll just leave it there. All right, other questions?
My question is to you, Mr. Yule. A mention was made about the market on recyclables being down. So correct me if I'm wrong, but we have been sending a lot of our recyclables all the way over to China. And if the profit motive is what it is based on what we're saying here tonight, that burning our trash is not profitable by comparison to recycling it with regard to jobs. So why aren't we building more recycling plants in this country and just recycle all our own stuff instead of sending it to China?
I'll start this by answering a different question I get, which is whenever I present how incineration is the most expensive and dangerous and most including way to manage waste or make energy, people always ask, why would local officials go for that? It sounds like a crazy idea. And my answer, and I'm not saying this to be flip, I'm dead serious, it's a combination of laziness, stupidity, and corruption on the part of local officials. In some cases, officials have landed in jail or come close than they should have, and in jail because of literal corruption that has enabled incineration to be promoted in communities. So I'm not just making this up. We have a lot of uncreative public officials that are unwilling to challenge you as people living in the communities that they just see as people who don't listen or don't throw the right things in the right bin or uneducated, whatever. They have a very condescending view of the public, and I've dealt with numerous departments of public works, and I see the same attitude from a lot of them, so I'm not just making this up, with plenty of data points to back this up. They see their job as just get it off the curb, make it go away. If they do that, they've done their job and people won't complain because no one worries about where away is, unless you live where away is, and then you come to meetings like this and you're like, what do we do about it? So our challenge is to get our public officials that are in charge of waste programs to be willing to be creative, to challenge themselves and their agencies, to challenge the public, and put the right policies in place that make it easy to divert the right amount of materials as much as we can, to separate more than they're used to separating, because part of why China is not taking all of our low-quality recyclables is because they're low quality. And part of the reason why they're low quality is because we're not educating people, we're not giving the right incentives, and we're doing things like single stream, put it all in one bin. The paper used to be separate, now single stream. Everything goes together and the value of it goes through the floor. And we've had the CEO of Waste Management, the biggest waste company in the world, admit that on TV. I have a video clip of it. That single stream is, it turns out to have been a bad idea. The value of the paper is trash. So we need to start separating better, and where they do separate better, they find they can get more on the market for their commodities. And we just need to get that in place. And there are plenty of examples of like pay as you throw.
Yep.
Kirsty described as basically a pay per bag program. About at least 7,000 communities in the country, including 4 whole states, do this already. Just like when you pay for electricity or water or gas, you pay for how much you use.
Right.
But with trash, in most places, you pay one fee and you get to be as wasteful as you want. And your neighbor can put out 10 bags and you put out 1, you pay the same fee. That doesn't make sense. And as soon as you start paying per bag, in the communities where they do this, they find on average an instant 44% drop in the amount of waste generated per person. And a lot of that is not just things going into recycling bins or hopefully also composting bins, but people even buying less in the first place, which gets to the reduced part, which is the most important. So doing the right policies will get us there. We just need to push our public officials.
If I could just say one thing about the plastics too on that, is that, and other materials, there are many products that are made to be, I swear, confusing when it comes to recycling, right? As soon as they started doing single stream, which again was partly because of what happened with markets in China, and China was setting it up so that they could then recycle well. Now that they've got their infrastructure, they're not taking our goods anymore, and they're trying to sell recycling equipment in the United States. So China planned this, don't kid yourself, right? And the waste companies made it happen because they didn't care if the recycling was happening, they just wanted to get rid of it as cheaply as possible. Then we look at our waste stream, and there are some materials that are, cardboard with a plastic top, or a plastic lid that's made of different plastic than the bottle. Or there's 7 different plastic resins and bioplastics. Well, the only plastics that are recyclable are 1, 2, and 5. Yet these companies are allowed to use all these others, right? Filmy plastic is not recyclable in the single stream system. Little things fall through and are not recyclable. So we have to look critically at what we're using and make sure it's designed to be recyclable. And if it's not, send it back to the producer and say, you pay to take care of it then, right? And that's what extended producer responsibility is. And another way of doing that is a bottle bill, a deposit return scheme. If we're using something, it better be recyclable, and the best thing to do is to put a fee on it, because then it becomes the producer's problem. Why should it be the municipality's problem? So we could really ask the municipalities to do something that's impossible as well, and citizens to do something that's impossible also, I would say. Deb, did you have a?
I do have a question. Currently, Wheeler Breda can have their ash landfills go up to 50 feet. And when we drive by, we see it going higher. Now, they're starting to fill in the valleys, but it looks like it's going higher, and then they're allowed to put dirt on top. I remember years past, we said they weren't covering it, they were covering it once a week, but it looks like it's a dirty dirt. It's not a clean dirt that they're putting on top of the ash pile. Who is responsible for measuring and saying, we hit the 50 feet? Is that being done by the EPA? It's certainly not being done by the town. I'm not out there with a tape measure. Who is responsible for telling them that they hit their limit?
Mass DEP. It's supposed to be Mass DEP. There's an engineering plan, and that landfill is supposed to be done when it hits the engineering plan. But we should keep an eye on it.
But I do believe that they collect their own LiDAR data and report back on that themselves. I don't think there is actually a secondary.
So they're
Oh, really?
reporting on their own levels, and no one really is going out there and checking.
That's what I've learned in all of
And they
that.
also call it
That's interesting.
instead of calling it a landfill, they call it a monofill because it's only ash, it's just one thing, not that it's made up of millions of different things. But that's just some rhetoric, correct?
That's fair and accurate term. I use that.
So they have 20 years of MSW underneath it.
Okay,
So,
in
yeah.
that case, yeah, they have normal trash on the bottom. Let me add one thing though, since you brought up the cover material, this is important, aside from the fox garden hen house issue that we just learned. Earlier I said something about incinerators being able to be paid twice for the same capacity when we were talking about put or pay things. There's another scheme with landfills that involves them getting paid twice in a way. And this is a scam that's been going on with the daily cover. It used to be that landfills are required at night to put fresh dirt on the top of the landfill so that the pollution from the trash doesn't blow into the community.
Right.
They learned years ago that they don't want to spend money for fresh dirt and fill up their airspace of their landfill, which is their commodity. So they learned that they can convince state governments to approve alternative daily cover. And this has come to include incinerator ash, contaminated soil, which might be what you're talking about, I don't know, construction, demolition waste, all sorts of things that are more valuable and more toxic, and that's why they're more valuable, than the normal trash. And they're using that to cover the landfill each night, which is even worse because a lot of those things are even more of a nuisance to the community. And instead of paying for something, they get paid to take something, so that's the double pay.
Ellie, you have a question?
Deb, just to address your question, so in a previous meeting with Wheelwright, they did say that they do an annual flyover, so they actually are monitoring that. So I have the details on that.
Excellent.
And as far as the coverage for the ash, so in another meeting, we asked the question, what are you covering? But they say it's daily cover, and they were covering the ash with ash, and that was considered the daily cover.
Yeah.
And every 7 days, it would be a soil, but some of the soil could be potentially contaminated.
And I've seen some of those reports as well, and
Yeah.
it's
So that's-
troubling.
Would
That
that
is
have
the
come up
case
on the
with the
microphones that
civilians.
Elle said that the ash is covered by a daily cover made up of ash, and that there's a weekly contaminated soil cover? So, to answer, thank you. Oh, they do a flyover, Wheelbrader does a flyover to test the height.
Which estimates how much capacity we have remaining. And
Yep.
it's annual.
An annual flyover, okay.
Yeah. We were told originally when the city got into recycling that it's going to save the city money because what we were recycling was going to bring value back to the city and monetary value. And now what we're hearing is that we're spending more money to recycle than we were supposed to be spending. And are you saying now that that is because we're not separating the paper, the plastic, and the glass?
So the recycling markets shift a lot. This is actually a good plug for composting because China can't compete with our composting. No one's bringing compost to China. So that market is very stable and you can be composting locally. So if you want to stop paying so much for waste disposal, the first thing I would do is get the compostables out, compost it locally, and that will save you a lot of the fees that you're paying to Wheelwright or whoever's hauling it to them. But recyclable markets, it used to be like some things you get paid for. Aluminum is the most valuable, usually get paid for that. Sometimes paper you get paid for, but they go back and forth. Sometimes you pay to get rid of it, sometimes you get paid to offload it. And at the moment, because of the market shift with China saying no to all of our contaminated stuff, the cost of recycling has gone up a lot because we don't have as many domestic markets for it. That's going to be temporary. Who knows how temporary before we get our domestic markets up. But except in rare exceptions around the country, even with this shift in the market, it's still usually more expensive to go ahead and incinerate it or even landfill it than it is to pay. So even if you're paying, like in Baltimore we learned recently, it's $50 a ton to burn, but it's $20 a ton to get rid of the recyclables. So you're still saving $30 a ton to recycle. It's just that you're still paying for the recycling instead of getting paid.
So in Cambridge, to give a more close to home example, they're paying $99 a ton to send it to the transfer station in Roxbury, and it's $70 a ton, I believe, for their recyclables. I would also, so we're seeing it's still less than waste, but it's more than it ever was. I would also argue, though, that the more your recyclables are separated, the better price you get. So the town I live in, you have to go there and sort it yourself. In those places, the market is much more stable, because if I'm giving you a bin of just milk jugs, and you know it's all milk jugs, then those are going to get recycled much more consistently than if I give you a bunch of plastic that went through a single stream facility and got improperly or partially sorted. And they sort as best they can. It's just not as good as people doing it. So the more it's sorted, dual stream or multi-sort, the better your money price is going to be. Cindy, did you have something?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask for your perspective on this. As I understand it, in the last state's solid waste master plan, the Patrick administration committed to a zero waste goal by mid-century. And I'm just wondering why we haven't been able to create more leverage around that, or if there's any perspective as lawyers on how we can work to hold this administration accountable to making steps in that direction.
So this was something I brought up at DEP last week, that we are not close to hitting our goals. We may be on target for our food waste goal. That could be possible because the 2010 to 2020 solid waste master plan ends December 31st, 2020. So we still have a full 2 years where we could be getting stuff done. So we could maybe hit that goal. Otherwise, no, we're not moving towards those goals as far as I can see. One of the problems is that the plan is a plan and doesn't have teeth, in theory, to be enforced in court. It's not like this has to happen or that will happen, which I think is instructive for writing the next solid waste master plan, right? If certain things don't happen by a certain date, it should trigger programs being adopted automatically, in my mind. That's one thing. But I do think, especially with folks like who we've got in the room here, who are bearing the brunt of our waste problem, and this is something that I will contact folks about, we have solid waste master plan meetings over this next year to write a new solid waste master plan. First, the Mass DEP should be accountable for what they haven't done. And that's something that we need people to show up at meetings and say. Unfortunately, it's tough because everyone's got a job and a family and a life, and it's tough to go to all these meetings. But that's something that I think is a really good idea and something that could be very helpful. We don't have a hook that I can think of or that I've seen that we can sue on, for instance, but there are other ways of making our voices heard and working with leveraging that.
This is not an issue for lawyers to give you answers to, because there are no hooks. There's nothing that says, oh, they didn't do it so we can sue them. It's a community organizing thing. You need to put the political pressure on them and not go do it. That's why politicians find it very easy to sign on to goals that are 30 years away. They might not even be alive when that happens, and no one's going to hold them accountable. So you need short-term goals that are concrete, and you need funding for them. And I would say if you do nothing else in influencing the state's direction on zero waste, and the same thing for local governments too, get them to adopt the Zero Waste International Alliance's official definition of zero waste and the zero waste hierarchy. I got Baltimore to do that in a unanimous resolution, and we need to do that because we're in this uphill battle against the EPA's backwards hierarchy that says incineration is better than landfilling, and all the local and state governments that follow along and say, well, EPA must know what they're doing, even though I had a head of EPA's waste division tell me, this is under Obama's administration, that waste hierarchy is backwards, that incineration shouldn't be on it, and that it needs to be updated. It's outdated, but they never updated it. So governments are still pointing to that, say that's what the right thing to do with waste is, and we need a counter current that says this is what zero waste is officially recognized to mean by the experts in the field, and create that groundswell of recognition for doing it the right way.
Joe?
You pointed to the map when you were talking about where the incinerators are located, and you pointed right in the middle of Marblehead, up in that area.
It's not located there.
Where, and said,
Yeah.
it's not located up there. Well, it may not be located up there, but I live right over here on the river, and I can see the plume from my window. And we have prevailing westerly winds in this part of the country. So the incinerator may not be there, but whatever is coming out of those smokestacks is definitely impacting the Nahant, Swampscott, where our governor lives, Marblehead, and that area. So maybe this meeting tonight, because here, we've all been to the Wheelabrator meetings ad nauseum, okay? We're the choir that you're preaching to.
Right.
So maybe the meeting should have been there. I'd be curious to know if there's anyone in the room from Nahant, Swampscott, or Marblehead.
I'm not from there, but you should know that neighbors in those communities really do care about this issue. Groups in Marblehead and in Salem signed on to comments that so many of our groups put into the state opposing this expansion. So the groups included HealthLink and Salem, Salem Alliance for for the environment. We could certainly reach out to them to see if they wanted to co-host an informational meeting up there.
Yeah. And I think that there are a lot of people who, I talk about this all over the state, and Wheelabrator comes up inevitably because it is so egregious. So I've spoken in places like Brookline and Newton and other places, and nobody wants their waste to be poisoning their neighbors. And I don't mean to imply that. What frustrates me is that in some places the system works and some places it doesn't. And that really seems unfair to me. That's why I get frustrated. But you're absolutely right. The more, and one of the things we can do too, there are a lot of great groups, small groups around the state who've passed plastic bag bans, for instance, in 85 communities. Those folks are kind of clued in, or as my 16-year-old likes to say, they're woke. And so I'm not allowed to say that at home, so I got to say it when I'm out of the house. But they're aware and they're thinking about these issues. So that's another strategy that I think we have to do a better job with, connecting with those groups, and then also connecting with planning authorities and other municipalities across the state, because everyone's feeling the pinch on recycling. So this is the time to change the system. I think Al, and then.
I just wanted to ask if you could touch on the benefits of composting versus putting it in your sink disposal. Because it is part of that zero waste strategy, and I think a lot of us, including myself until a previous meeting, didn't realize really what that meant when it goes down the sink.
You want me to do it?
Disposal.
John
did a great job, so I know you know.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So if you put it down your sink, it goes to your wastewater treatment plant, and there it either ends up as sewage sludge, or it's part of the water or the air, right? It's like there's three outputs from the wastewater treatment plant. If it goes into the water, then you're increasing the bio load on the water, which is tough for the plant. The stuff that goes in the air, probably not that, maybe some methane, so not that good. But the biggest problem is that you're increasing the volume of the sewage sludge, and you're doing two things. One, that means there's more contaminated sewer sludge to process. And then the other thing it means is that clean food waste that should be becoming a nice clean soil additive, and when you compost or when you process it in an anaerobic digester by itself without sewer sludge and then finish it in composting, which is something that there's a big Connecticut facility that's doing. So they put it in an AD facility, which is like a stomach, and then burn the gas and take the liquid and the digestate and finish it in composting for a couple weeks. When you do that, you can add it to the soil and it actually sequesters or contains the carbon. So instead of making it a toxic substance that then has to be given away because it's not clean, and it's not something I'd want in my garden or on a field my kids were playing on in their school. Instead of that, you can actually have a product that we can grow food in and replenish our soil and capture a lot of the carbon that we need to capture if we're going to prevent climate change. Anything else?
No, that's great. Yeah, a lot of sewage sludge ends up on farm fields. It's toxic. It's not good that we grow food in it. It's not allowed to be considered organic, but composted food waste could be. So that's one distinction. And just a general principle, don't take things that are toxic and mix it with stuff that's not toxic. Don't take things that are smelly and mix it with stuff that's not smelly. You do that and you create something that's just toxic and smelly. So take the things that are more valuable and keep them separate. The biggest thing in any kind of materials management, don't call it waste management, but materials management, is to keep the materials separate so they can keep their value. We create waste by mixing things.
How do we convince people who, when you tell them something is, like Wheelabrator is toxic ash, and they come back with, well, it's the DEP and the EPA says it's fine. I mean, they're there to protect us. How do I come back with an answer?
You're allowed to smoke. It's not safe, but you're allowed to smoke, right? I mean, we're allowed to do lots of things that aren't safe, right? People ride motorcycles all the time. My son said to me, "Oh, that guy's got a convertible. He must not be able to afford a whole car because that can't be safe." You know, I mean, we do things all the time that aren't safe. Why, we allow them. So I guess that's my flippant answer, but.
My answer's not too far behind, but part of it is also a definitional thing when they're playing word games. Because if you're saying it's toxic and they say, oh, it's not legally hazardous, those are different things. It could be toxic and also legally non-hazardous because it doesn't pass the rigged, chemically manipulated test. And both can be true at the same time. And so just the common sense of all the toxic things that went in being toxic, like the mercury and all the other metals and stuff that are toxic metals. Where do they come out? They can't have it both ways. They don't disappear, they don't turn into energy. That's physically impossible. So they're either in the air or the ash. And if you corner them on that, they can't get out of it. Because even if it was going to go in the air, if they captured it, that means it's now in the ash. So you can't have it disappear. It's got to all go somewhere, and either they have to admit that they're polluting your air, or they have to admit that they're threatening your groundwater, and the fact is they're doing both.
You brought up a really good point earlier about a good way to increase our recycling rates by separating. But I feel like we've hit a brick wall here in Saugus because our haulers who are under contract to separate started putting it all together in the trucks. So the people are saying this, and even if they continue to separate, it's going in there anyway. And I don't even know how to address it. Do you have any? I've spoken with our recycling coordinator. I'm not sure how to approach it, that this is a trend going in the wrong direction.
Mass DEP does not allow that. Mass DEP has given some waivers for certain recyclables where there's no market at all, and very, very small amounts to be thrown into incinerators or landfills. And that's only when you've got a load of separated recyclables and they literally can't go to the recycling facility because the line is too long and it's 6 o'clock at night and they ask for a waiver. What you're talking about is blatantly illegal. So that is something that, in my opinion, that is something that Mass DEP should be notified of. And if someone sees someone doing that, then give me a call and we'll call Mass DEP and we'll follow up on it, because
They're doing it regularly. That's
yeah. That should be something that the recycling coordinator should have a sense of where the recyclables are supposed to go. They must not be going to I assume that you guys send your stuff to Charlestown, to the MRF there, but I don't know. And that's where it's supposed to. If they don't have we took this on this day there, wherever they're supposed to usually take it, it's pretty easy to prove. They've got to track all this, so. DEP, let's call DEP, it would be my answer, because it's not allowed. Rosalie, did you?
Could you just give us a little update on the CLF appeals?
Yep. So the appeal of the DEP permit, what CLF filed was in harmony with what the town of Saugus filed as well, which was arguing that the Mass DEP could not issue a permit until the Board of Health of the town of Saugus reviewed this expansion of capacity under a site assignment hearing. So the Board of Health asked Wheelabrator to apply for a site assignment hearing. They never did. The Board of Health asked them again. They did not do so. And then the DEP went forward and issued the permit regardless. So the argument in that case is that that was not kosher, that first Board of Health has the first authority and should have been able to review this. Right, we made a motion for summary judgment because the facts are not at issue. There are no questions. The town of Saugus and CLF have made the same argument generally, which is Board of Health has the power, and they made the argument. So now we'll see what their response is to that.
There's a him back in the back there.
Yeah, should may alluded to 3 incinerators in Essex County.
Yes.
Now, what's the radius that they cover with this, with their pollutants in the air?
That I see come up as a question a lot, and there's no real solid answer to it because it's not like there's a certain bubble where the air hits a wall and it falls within 30 miles or something. That's just, there's no such thing. So some people put numbers out there like 30 miles. But the fact is some pollutants are a lot heavier. Like you might have heard of from cigarette smoking, one of the things they know that causes cancer is benzoapyrene, which is one of the alphabet soup of chemicals called PAHs that create dehydrolyzed polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. They're heavy. So they fall close. Certain other pollutants that are heavier will fall close. Some things like dioxins travel as far as the Canadian Arctic and contaminate food chains, and things like mercury and dioxin that once they are fat soluble, they end up in the food supply. And those fish and other animals travel, and if they're killed and served as food, the food products travel. And so the health impacts can travel quite a bit. So there's no point at which anyone should feel safe if the largest source of dioxin in the Canadian Arctic were incinerators in Iowa and Pennsylvania, which is the case.
At the beginning of your discussion, you mentioned that you had some success in having these facilities shut down. And you mentioned how many times it's an incinerator with an ash pile. What was the disposition of the ash pile and so forth after the business is no longer there? Because I would hate to think that we'll be stuck, if we ever are successful and Wheelabrator disappears, that we're going to be stuck with a big ash pile here that we won't even know what the hell to do with.
Okay. Well, first of all, we've been very successful stopping proposed facilities. Existing ones, once they're in, they're harder to stop. So only because we've helped and been successful stopping so many proposed incinerators and other noxious facilities that there aren't many left to fight. There's still some proposals out there, but not much. So we're in a phase of now working on shutting existing ones down. So I can't say from experience, having shut existing ones down yet. Give me some time. We have some successes that are in the next year going to start happening, particularly in Maryland. So we'll have that track record in a year when we talk again. As far as the ash dumps, though, I mean, I know of incinerators that have shut down their own, or other folks, not me, but people I know, successfully got them closed. Some of them have been torn down. You want to dismantle them carefully if you don't want to allow toxic dust getting all over, especially when they level a smokestack and see clouds of dust. But that's still temporary. That stuff can be swept away and you can clean up a site. The ash dump, they're not going to pick up and relocate that. It's just unreasonable to think that anyone will try. Now, if there's a case for any that should be picked up and relocated, it's probably one that's on a swamp, right next to the ocean. So if the community decided we're going to campaign to get this moved, I wouldn't think you're crazy for doing that. But it's going to be very hard. Most likely it's going to be there forever, and it's a matter of how do you keep it from getting flooded forever, which is going to be a tall order. But in the shorter term, it's just going to be a matter of capping it, keeping it enclosed, and then trying to monitor and avoid the leakage that will inevitably happen because it doesn't even have a liner. So sometimes when we do see landfills that are picked up and relocated, it's because they don't have a liner and they're relocating them onto lined areas. But I don't know that there's a precedent for doing that longer distance. I mean, usually it's like right next door, they have a lined area and they move things to another side.
Matter against the expansion of the landfill. I'd like to see them do more, but I
Like what?
pretty much can say that about everything, so.
Yeah, like what?
Well, first of all, there's two pieces of this, right? One piece is opposing the expansion of the landfill and eventually shutting down the incinerator, okay? And I think that Lynn and Revere and the other surrounding communities, both south and north and west of this facility, all have a good argument for doing that, because as we talked about, the air shed is not something that hits a wall and then stops. It's dangerous to everybody. So that's one piece, looking at the public health part of this and helping campaign to shut this down. The other piece of this is we hear all the time it has to go somewhere. And as I hope I made clear, most of it doesn't have to go into a landfill or incinerator and shouldn't go into a landfill or incinerator. And then once we figure out what that last 10 or 20% is, we can start really drilling down on that and getting those materials redesigned or taken care of by the producer. So that part of it, making sure that each city and town in Massachusetts is doing a much better job at reducing their waste first and then recycling and composting. We've got really good template laws on a local level. We also need to do that statewide and New England-wide. We need to make sure that we're not using plastics that can't be recycled. We need to ban those single-use plastics entirely. We need to make sure that we require composting and access to recycling everywhere, and we need pay-as-you-throw throughout all of New England, I would argue. So looking at your own trash in each city and town will help solve that inevitable argument of, wait a minute, you shut down Wheelabrator or Saugus, where's our stuff going to go? And it will save those communities a lot of money. So which is one of the reasons I like working on this, because I've worked in municipal government, I've worked as a municipal attorney. There's never enough money. It's a really tough gig.
Thank you.
When you were talking about composting, are you talking that each community set up a composting area?
So another reason I like zero waste is because it's like Italian cooking, it's regional, right? The best Italian cooking is what you do in your village, right? My recipes are better than Rosalie's recipes, right? I'm sorry, Rosalie. And so, it's all an evolution. Every community's got to figure out what works in your community. Where I live in Central Mass, if you have a big yard, get a composting bin or throw it in the woods and deal with it that way. That way it doesn't have to travel. That way, just make sure you turn it over and it's got some air in it once in a while so it doesn't create methane, and put it far enough away from your house so you're not attracting critters. That's fine. If you live in a more suburban area, then you've got to be a little bit more clever about it and use either a green cone, which is pest proof, or you've got to hire a composting service, or just be really careful about what you put in there, right? And then another thing that a lot of people in cities have done is contact someone and have their compost picked up. That's great. City of Cambridge right now is still piloting a curbside pickup service, which is fantastic. And they've already taken a lot of food waste and they've taken it out of their system and decreased their waste. Now they're mixing it with sewer sludge, which I'm not happy about, but they're getting it out of the waste stream. And I think eventually they'll end up having some kind of a transfer station for composting their food waste. So, in the urban areas, we need transfer stations just for the food waste. If your community has a couple acres where that can happen, all the better. There's a really good composting facility I've been told too in Saugus. So, again, you got to be careful, because a composting facility, if there's a lot of trucks, or an anaerobic digester facility, if there's a lot of trucks, it's not something you necessarily want in a residential district or in a wetlands, or, there's lots of things you got to be careful about. But there's lots of different ways of solving that problem. And that, as Mike said, that's something that's local, creates local jobs, and solves the waste problem, a big chunk of the waste problem, almost immediately.
Other resource on that, the Institute for Local Self-Reliance.
ILSR.
They're experts on this. If you go to ilsr.org, you'll find their website, or you can just Google the food waste hierarchy, and it gets into, they have a whole hierarchy just on food waste and prioritizes the backyard composting over other things.
Okay. We all set? Deb, can you wrap up, please, ma'am?
First of all, I want to thank Mike, Kirsty, and Mary. I think we had phenomenal presentations tonight. I want to thank each and every one of you for coming out. I also want to thank SAVE, the Saugus Action Volunteers for the Environment, and the Saugus River Watershed Council for bringing the desserts and all the pastries over there. So please help yourself. Thank you very much. And again, I'm thanking both the SCTV, the Saugus Cable, and Revere Cable for coming. And I'm sure we're going to hear more. So please, if you have any questions, please reach out to these experts.
And go have a snack.
Have a snack, and as Marjorie said, reach out to Rosalie Vincent, or you can call me, Deborah Panetta, as well, and be sure to get you the right information. Thank you all very much.